I'm going to give us a sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan. And as a co-host today, we have Phyllis returning after just one episode, a really quick turnover.
Right. Yes, I'm Phyllis, and I'm a postdoc here in the philosophy department at CEU.
And our guest today is Gabriela.
Hi, thanks for having me today. My name is Gabriela Juncosa. I am finishing off my PhD here at CEU in the Department of Network and Data Science, and currently I am a postdoc in the Complexity Science Hub.
Yeah. Right on. So why don't you start off by telling us about your work?
Sure. Yeah. So in my PhD work, we investigated the. We worked on political communication in social media. Mainly, we were interested in the participation aspect of it. So whether if there were if perception biases in a way were affecting the way people were participating on the discourse. And we did this in two ways. So the traditional way is, of course, getting social media data and trying to see how the conversation unfolds, what are the characteristics. And then we also designed a very small experiment in a very limited setting to test a few of these interactions and a few of the theories. Would you like me to go into the specifics of?
Yeah, please, that'd be great.
Okay. Yeah. So the first project, the social media project, what we did was we wanted to study conversations around political topics, of course. So what we did is we took advantage of the 2020 U.S. election, and we went into YouTube and downloaded the comment section for 10 news outlets at the time.
Cool.
So the main news outlets: CNN, Fox, ABC, CBS, Newsmax, One American News Association, and a few others that right now I don't remember. And the idea here was to not look at the threads, but the conversations per se. So we download. So we went into the main level comments that had replies, and then we tried to download as many replies as we could, so that we could reconstruct the conversation. And then, we sat down and said, like, okay, how do we analyze this data? And there, at the time at least, there was this concern that toxicity was hindering discourse, was hindering conversations. So then the idea is like, if we see online toxicity, then the conversation ends. And it's quite a binary aspect, right? A toxic conversation ends, a not toxic conversation flows. So we wanted to study this, and what we did was we categorized all the comments into toxic and non-toxic comments using Perspective API. This was not the times of AI yet, or LLMs, so we had to do this with a pre-trained model. And what we did was because we wanted to study the flow of the conversation, then we couldn't study per se, like the toxicity was already there. So then we had a little bit of trouble understanding what model we could use. And then the conceptualization that we came up with was that a conversation has state, right? So you can enter a conversation and feel that the conversation is conducive to open dialogue. It's an open conversation. It feels good. You feel like you can like this, right? You feel that we can share what we truly want to share, or you can feel that the conversation is a little bit tense, is perhaps not open-minded or so. But it's a difficult conceptualization because these are hidden states, right? Like we cannot really measure whether if the conversation was conducive or not to open dialogue. But in theorizing this way, we were able to use a group of models called hidden Markov models. And what they do is that if you have a theoretical link between your observations and the states, then you can use the sequence of observations to infer these states. So just as an example, because this is quite an abstract concept, so as an example, say you are outside of a room and you don't know if the room is occupied or not. right? But you can hear some muffled sounds or you can hear some things. So based on what of the noises that you can hear or not, you can make inferences on whether the room was occupied or not. So quite in a similar way, what we say, okay, if I see a chain of toxic, non-toxic comments and then I observe the end of the conversation, can I infer whether if this conversation was conducive or not conducive to open dialogue? And this is what we did with this work. And there were two interesting results. One a little bit data-driven, that was counterintuitive to our expectation. Because even if the way that I am describing this, you may think that a conversation has two binary states, right? One that is conducive to dialogue and one that is not. So when we tried, the first thing that we did is like, okay, let's try to fit a model with two states, a binary state in more in like an intuitive understanding of how conversation should evolve. And interestingly, what we found was that when we fit it to states, we could link the state associated to self-censorship, silence, or the end of the conversation to more toxic content. However, if we use the data to inform us how many states the model should have, so what is the number of optimal states, we found that a typical conversation in our datasets has 4 states. And surprisingly enough, when we fitted a model with 4 states, then this association of silence and toxicity goes away. So when we allow for the conversation to have more than a binary state, then we no longer observe a connection between toxic content and the end of the conversation. We see that actually toxic content is more likely in previous states of the conversation, meaning that it is not closing conversations, people are actually engaging with toxicity, or conversations, if you may, are surviving toxicity in any way. This was in general this project, and it to me was interesting in that it tells us that, of course, I think there has to be an understanding here that social media data is not necessarily representative of the general public. We know this already. We know that people that use social media have certain characteristics, and more importantly, people that comment on social media have specific characteristics. So, of course, we have to be careful with this interpretation, but it's interesting that it seems that social media is this space where toxicity is not ending conversations, is not closing dialogue, in a way is, in some instances even, is making dialogue go more. So why, how? Then this is, of course, a question for maybe for philosophers or sociologists. This is, or maybe for a next step. But anyways, I found this insight of the project very interesting.
That's super interesting. Can I just check if I've understood?
Sure.
Okay, so toxicity was found to kind of shut down a conversation if there were fewer states.
If you assume the conversation can only have 2 states.
Okay.
Yeah. So in this logic, sorry.
Go ahead.
In this logic of a conversation being conducive or not conducive to dialogue. So if we think of a conversation of having a binary state, then we see that there's a connection with toxicity.
So, and one more clarification. So conducive or not conducive dialogue, meaning that more or less dialogue happens after the toxic comment?
No, No, that's not what it means. This is the state of the conversation. So we think about this as like, say that we can, this is a bit of a metaphor, so it's difficult to wrap your head around, but think about that the conversation is an object, right? That can be moody or not moody, right? So it has 2 states. Or it can be happy or sad. And depending on the state of the conversation, then we draw a link to the type of observation that we can see. So if you are sad or happy, you can generate toxic, non-toxic, or you can even close the conversation. So all the realm of antisocial comments are possible. But the key here is which state is more likely to produce which. So say you are a moody conversation, then we would expect that you would be a little bit more toxic than otherwise. And that was our expectation. But then when we allowed for more states, then that disappears.
So the 4 states that you went to, that's kind of like a more fine-grained analysis of states. What were those? We're not labeling the states as per se. Okay.
But what we are seeing is that we have one of them, for example, in which the conversation by definition cannot end. So the probability of ending the conversation is 0.
Okay.
And that one has the highest toxicity. So if you were looking for toxicity, then you would have to go to state where the conversation cannot end. Meaning, so like if you think about the conversation as a sequence of states, then if you were looking for toxicity, then your chances are greater if you go to previous sections of the conversation, which of course also in a sense it makes sense because I mean people don't have unlimited time. For example, there are other reasons to leave a conversation, not necessarily because it's toxic. But it is important that we found evidence that toxicity doesn't necessarily end conversation, that it might
That's so interesting.
And can you briefly define toxicity for us? How did you build it into the model?
Well, toxicity is, so we get the definition from Perspective API, this pre-trained model, and toxicity is defined as a comment that has a feature, so it's left a little bit open, that would make you want to leave a conversation. So if you read a comment, then you want to leave. So then by this definition, it was an important definition for us because we were studying this intuition that if you see antisocial behavior, you will leave, then this definition sort of fitted with our expectation. But we also tested another dimension that is very much correlated to toxicity, and it's whether a comment has insults of any form, and the patterns, they are the same. So the behavior replicates. So yes, toxicity you can think about, sometimes there are insults, sometimes there's just like racism, not necessarily insults, sometimes it's just like unpleasant content.
So one of the things that you define toxicity as something that might make you want to leave a conversation, but then you found that the definition of toxicity that you were using made people stay in the conversation. That's so interesting. So then so was it a particular set of topics that was prejudged to make somebody want to leave a conversation that were used to sort of build that definition out?
We didn't have enough granularity to go too much into the topics, but in general, we did a smaller analysis, but in general, this is topic independent. So this happens across topics. There are a few topics where this effect is a little bit stronger. So if I remember correctly, there was one topic related to the Black Lives Matter movement. So then there was a stronger engagement with toxic content. But this is just this has to do more with the topic rather than the relationship between toxic content and the end of a conversation.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that a lot of social media algorithms were found to optimize for people's discontent, that people seem to scroll more if they're discontent. Do you think that has something to do with it? That there's something like hate scrolling, that I'm more upset, therefore I scroll more, or I'm more upset, therefore I'm more engaged in the conversation?
So this is not my area of expertise, but I would in general say that there is the concern that negative feeling, toxicity, insults drives engagement. And I think social media algorithms, we know they are optimized for engagement. And unfortunately, at this moment in history, for some reason, the engagement seems to be linked to negative aspects of our human nature. So yeah, certainly this might be related to an algorithm process in YouTube. For example, it could be that just the main level comments that are more inflammatory, insulting, or what have you are being driven to the top for some reason that we don't know. We can't know this because YouTube doesn't allow academics to study the algorithm. So like we would never know, but this could be happening in the background, or it could just be that people go to YouTube and like, you know, they had a bad day and they want to pick a fight with someone, and you know, fights are engaging, and it could just be trolls, right? It's just people just shouting into the void or stuff like that. So yeah, that would be my best answer to this.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And if I can follow up with one more thing, when you see that it's triggering engagement, do you get that at an individual level? Like, is it more likely that, say, 60% or 70% fall off from the conversation when toxicity enters, but that 30% are there and indefinitely engaged?
Right. Unfortunately, we don't have the data to check for that. What we do know is that the longer the conversation goes, engagement goes down. And this is just because, I mean, people have lives and they can't be there for long times. But our conversations are not long enough to link it to what you're asking. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's fair.
Yeah, I think related to this, I was wondering about like the effects of different platforms on what one might see. Right. So when I think of YouTube, I do think of it as for the more like long form. It has short form stuff too, but it's people talk about it as people go to it for the more long form stuff, especially now that there are all these alternatives geared towards short form content. So was that I feel like that makes it a good choice to study, but I'm wondering if we'd maybe see different patterns in on different platforms.
That's a very interesting question, and that is one that we unfortunately could not check, because I think you're right. There, especially in the last couple of years, we have seen that political conversations are happening in a more podcast setting, right? A more long form content. At the time we didn't check for that, so we excluded podcasts, actually.
Oh, interesting.
We were interested more in mainstream news media for one reason particularly, and the simple reason was that we thought that they would they have an editorial process, so that they would do that the news that they would publish, they wouldn't be intentionally inflammatory or I mean, this is not always the case, of course, but at least that the editorial process would control the content that they were posting on YouTube. When you go to podcasts, then the content is a little bit of a wild card. And it just at the time we didn't have the resources to deal with that, but this is an extremely relevant question. And I'm sure many people are looking into that. In fact, I think there's a recent paper suggesting that podcasts actually do have an effect on people's political opinions and participation online. But yes, we couldn't test this, unfortunately, in this setting. Maybe next time.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah,
and I was thinking, like, some people might be commenting on videos even if they don't watch the video, right? Some people might just be going to shitpost. So can you imagine a situation where, say, YouTube wouldn't let an account post unless they viewed like 80% of a video or something? Do you have any intuitions? Like, what did you see in the data that you'd say sort of drives your intuitions to answer in one way or the other?
Well, this is an interesting. I don't know if I would. I don't know how much of the video the people that are commenting are viewing. Like, I can't tell. But what you say is interesting because recently, in the realm of misinformation, one intervention that was used, I believe, in X or other platforms was to prevent people from sharing things that they wouldn't have read otherwise. They didn't read before sharing. And there is some evidence that if you nudge people into reading the content, then they might be less likely to share misinformation. When it comes to commenting, I guess it's interesting. I have to think about this, but my intuition would be that for the people that are unintentionally unintentionally extreme, this might work. But for people that are already extreme in their views, there is a confirmation bias happening on here, right? So sometimes I would imagine that some of these comments is less about the content and more about reaffirming people's own position. That would be my guess. But it would be interesting to test whether if you ask people to either watch 80%, as you say, of the content, or even reflect on the content, would this effect go down? But it's an interesting research question. Yeah.
And do you have data about likes for comments?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
So was there anything interesting there?
No, not really. We didn't really see any patterns. But also the problem is that to update the data, it's a very intensive process. So we also couldn't update it. There might be some patterns, but with the data that we have, we didn't see anything interesting. Yeah.
That's fair. Because I'm wondering how somebody getting engagement with their post, if they're engaged in some kind of flame war, would either drive or mitigate them posting even further. Like if I post a hateful comment that gets a lot of likes, am I satisfied? Or does that spur me on to keep posting? And I'm wondering what happens in an engagement where, say, one person's getting a lot of likes on their comments and the other person's not getting any.
Right. But also something important here is that would imply doing the analysis at the user level. Right, and our analysis was not at the user level, and this was an intentional choice because we didn't want to study individuals that were exiting the system, although one could. But for us, it was more, the unit of observation was the conversation. So this is not an object, but this is just like a metaphor for
Yeah, you're a network scientist. I'm a cognitive scientist. So
That's so interesting.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I know. So I know you said you chose like a kind of broad range of different news sources for the election, and the findings generalized across them. But I'm wondering if there were any like surprising things you found
so there were
across sources.
One thing that was not surprising was that like Fox News has a lot of toxic content, but that's not quite surprising. But I was very surprised that ABC News gets a lot of toxic content, and I was this was surprising to me. But then I realized so. We have to remember here that if the commenters are being toxic, that doesn't necessarily mean that the content of the news outlets is toxic. This can just be trolls, right?
Right.
And for some reason, ABC News is trolled a lot, which is an interesting thing. I mean, I'm not from the US, so I don't really understand this. Maybe there's history behind this that I'm not. Yeah, or maybe just ABC doesn't do a lot of moderation. There are some news outlets with a lot of resources that do heavy moderation, so maybe just the toxic comments were removed before we had a chance to look at them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I forgot, you were checking the valence of the content, or not at all? You just kind of lumped all the networks together, pulled the data, and just were looking at the sort of broad content comment level? We
were looking at the comment level.
So there was no inclusion of what the sentiment, say, of the title of the video was as well?
No.
Okay, gotcha.
We didn't look at it. But going back to your question, the reason why we wanted also established news outlets is because we thought that usually the language tends to be a little bit more neutral, less emotional. So we didn't want to deal with the outlets sort of like trying to spark people's emotions. We wanted to control that a little bit.
So-and-so destroys their political opponent, or none of these titles on YouTube.
As I said, this is not always the case. I mean, if you read through some of these titles,
Fox
they're a little
News
bit inflammatory.
Yeah.
But if you go to the podcast world, and this is even like
off
more,
the charts. Yeah.
So we intentionally didn't want to deal with that. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Did you limit it by like length of video at all, or
no?
Interesting.
We just took everything that we could. Yeah. What would be? Yeah, I'm interested now. What would be the reasoning to?
I guess I'm just thinking people might comment more on longer videos, like
but
it's playing while they comment or something, or still, or
interestingly. So news outlets, they don't usually publish long videos.
No,
they usually publish like 2 to 3 minutes, like snapshots. I'm assuming it's because they already have a channel like on TV that they don't want to drive people away from that.
Yeah,
I would
okay.
say. But I don't remember seeing anything more than 5 to 10 minutes. Really.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a short form content.
Yeah.
Can you describe the methods a little more? So you're using hidden Markov models.
Mm-hmm.
So what can you kind of guide us through a network scientist's mind of how you picked the question, why you pulled the data you did, and then what the analysis looks like?
The question is, I think it's common to us, right? I was interested in what we were seeing online. It seemed to me at the time when I was proposing my PhD dissertation that the online work was really going out of control. It was becoming this very, very hostile place. So I wanted to understand, if anything, what impact it was having on political conversations, mainly. That was my interest. And then as a network scientist and or computational social scientist, my approach to things is that I first wanted to study social media data because that's the logical place to start. But of course, there are a lot of limitations in the way we do this analysis, right? So it was important to me also to get hints of something in the data, but then to bring it back to an experiment so that we could maybe test some other hypotheses that we couldn't otherwise. As for the method, I think it's been a long time, so I'm not exactly sure how we arrived to this method. Maybe like a lot of conversations. I'm sure we tried a lot of things. But then it was, I think, hidden Markov models fitted because we were conceptualizing this as, like the conversation having a state of mind, which I know it sounds a little bit silly, but like we were thinking about this, like, okay, what if the conversation were to have a mind of its own and just like create these comments. So then in this context, it makes sense to study it in that way, because we were not so much interested on whether, if the previous comment is toxic, what's the probability of the next comment being toxic or non-toxic. That was not our interest. It was more like, okay, what is the toxicity doing for the vibe in general, right? And like when you put it this way, then you have to think about something else. So it's toxicity killing the vibe in a way. Mm-hmm. So yeah. Anyways, the process, I am not sure right now, but yeah, this was kind of the idea.
Really cool. I really like that idea. It didn't click until just now, so I'm
okay.
Go ahead. Yeah, I really like that concept because because hidden Markov models are really good at, on the cognitive science side, of really looking at how the mind sort of makes decisions, mm-hmm. Especially picking up on patterns of behavior, mm-hmm. and beliefs. So it's really cool that you took this concept and then applied it to the comments, mm-hmm. like the conversation as a whole, because so much is on comment, and that's also how I was previously, just 30 seconds ago, thinking about your work at the comment level, but mm-hmm. it's really at the conversation level, and mm-hmm. I missed that in your first introduction. Mm-hmm. You said it just didn't click. Mm-hmm. Really nice. So with the 4 states, can you go over those one more time? So what the 4 states were that you said once you sort of expand it out from 2 to 4, you get a better model.
Right. So as I said, we didn't look too much into depth into the 4 states. Because our interest was just like to describe this silence state. So this is the state where there was only one state where the conversation could end, meaning that there was only one state responsible for the end of the conversation. The other 3 states, the probability of ending the conversation was either completely 0 or very, very small, I think something like 1%. Okay, so for us, it was not, we were not so much interested in studying what happens when you don't close the conversation. For us, it was more interesting to, like, first of all, have a narrative to say, like, a conversation state is not necessarily binary. There may be some more diversity. And secondly, is like, okay, if we think about a non-binary state, or non-binary states, then is silence connected to toxicity? So if we were to look for toxicity, do I still go at the end of the conversation or do I go somewhere else? So this was the main idea of the paper. I would imagine that as a communication scientist, the other states are very interesting. But for the purpose of this project, for us, it was only important to understand what is this end of the conversation, what is happening, and if we were to look for toxicity, this was a good place to look. And as I said, when we think about this in 2 states, then the answer is yes. But if we expand to 4 states, then the answer is no.
Cool.
Yeah. I don't know if that clarifies.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It does. I still have questions about the states, though. I guess I'm just wondering, of the 4 states, are they all, it was the shift? So before it was conducive or not conducive, that was the binary. But when you went to 4, is it that it was more about like the sequence in a conversation? Like, are we at the start of it, in the middle, or at the end? Or is it?
Right. I don't think, no, we can't say that. We can only say,
because I imagine it kind of moves around.
Right. We are only able to separate from the end and before. Whether if the states that are not at the end are in the middle or at the beginning, that I don't know. We can't disentangle those things. But I can only tell you that these states happened anytime, but not at the end.
Okay.
I know that's kind of like a frustrating thing, because it would be, I see what you're going. It would be interesting to say like, oh, okay, we have a state that explains the beginning of the conversation, the middle, the second half, and then the end. But with this methodology, we can't go there. Yeah.
I guess what I was wondering is, you said the state you were interested in was where there was a high probability that the conversation was going to end.
But always associated to the end.
Yeah.
So our interest was saying like, is the end of the conversation. So if I were to look for toxicity, so say I have this conversation in front of me and say, I want to have the highest chance of finding a toxic comment.
Okay.
Where do I go?
Yeah.
Right. And if you hear all the conversations online about social media, say like, oh, if the conversation turns toxic, it ends. So that would give you the impression that if you were to look for toxic content, then you have to go at the end.
Yeah.
But then we found that no,
that's true.
Actually
that's
not
so
the case.
Interesting.
You go anywhere but the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
that's
great.
really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm more interested what Phyllis has to say in comment. Just because of, the work on, because you're looking at conversation and dialogue, sort of in a rough sense, right? Like your work applies to that. I'm curious what that.
Yeah, I'm still like kind of piecing all my thoughts together. But I guess one thing I'm starting to wonder about is if you have thoughts about the differences between like real life conversations and online. I mean, I guess we shouldn't call them that. In-person conversations and online. The ones online are just as real life as the in-person ones. Because I guess I'm thinking, originally when I was thinking of that binary between conducive and non-conducive, I feel like with an in-person conversation, the conducive ones are the good ones, right? Like we want to, and you described it as kind of like an open conversation, kind of like ours, like where you feel comfortable and stuff. So to me, I'm like, okay, those are what we want. Right. But then if I think about online conversations, a conversation that's conducive in the sense that it persists a lot seems like it might not be such a good thing, or like there's something like drawing someone into doing that. So there's that kind of disanalogy between the in-person conversations and the online ones. And I guess I'm wondering like about various differences between in-person and online that you might have thought about.
Right. I haven't yet had the pleasure of studying in-person conversations, but I think the dynamics are definitely quite different. I think in-person conversations, there's a lot that we try to control. So there's a combination of our own internal norms and our perception of what is the social norm or what is the context. So then there's a lot of play when we decide on how I'm going to portray myself. And in the experiment that we ran for my thesis, we tried to look at this question in a very, very small setting, although it was also online, but with the analogy of like, okay, say I am in a party. And we're all going to talk about controversial topics. We're going to talk about abortion, and we're going to talk about LGBTQ plus issues and stuff like that. So we know we are getting into dangerous territory. How do I decide whether if the intention is to connect to as many people as possible, because you are in a social gathering, you want to know as many as people as you can. If that is the intention, how do I decide whether if I share my true opinion on a topic? And the answer to this question was somewhat surprisingly, because theory always tells you that there are certain personality characteristics that will determine this behavior. And there's one theory in particular that we tested, is called the spiral of silence. And the idea here was like, the defining factor is an individual's fear of isolation. So if an individual is very fearful of being isolated from others, and they perceive the opinion climate, meaning they think that people will not like their opinion that they have, then they will choose to not share it or hide it in a way, lie or whatever. But interestingly enough, in this experiment, we didn't see that. We saw that an individual's fear of isolation did not predict the probability of sharing an opinion. And what was a more important driver was whether if they perceive their opinion to be in the majority. So if I go into a party and I know that people are going to accept me or align with what I think, then I share that thought. Instead, and my fear of isolation does not play into that decision.
How do you know it doesn't play into the decision? Because if you're in the minority, if you're in the majority, then you wouldn't risk isolation as much. I guess I was thinking. So could those two be related, or?
Right, but then we have a setting which separates these two.
Okay,
right?
and you found there are people who don't have this fear of isolation but do respond to the...
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
This was the experimental design that we have. So it's interesting. Yeah. But also, of course, these experiments are very artificial, and it's difficult to actually test personal characteristics in
I guess that's what I was wondering. Like, what if... well, I guess one way to ask a question is, if it's not fear of isolation that explains this majority, the
decision to share.
Yeah,
so
the
we
decision
are predicting
to share.
The decision to share an opinion.
Yeah, and if that responds to whether that opinion is predicted to be the majority opinion or not, and not whether someone is afraid of isolation, what could explain it?
We didn't test for the drivers, but you're probably right. There's maybe fear of isolation is playing into it. Yeah. Maybe just the desire of not really, the willingness of not liking to have an argument can also play into it.
Okay, yeah, right. Right.
Just like, maybe the purpose is not really to fight. Maybe the purpose is connect. So maybe the prioritizing connection can also drive into it. There are many factors.
I see. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I guess I was thinking initially, like, it would have to be fear of isolation. That's why I was wondering if that was getting smuggled in. Like, people don't think they have a fear of isolation, but that's getting revealed in their
but if you think about it in
a
networking setting, right? Like, you're getting to know your new colleagues. You might not be fearful of being isolated in general in life. Yeah. But the objective there doesn't have to be with isolation. It has to be with connection. So you go there to connect to other people, and that is the main driver. So if you want to connect to others, and if you have controversial ideas on abortion, let's say, then you might not want to reveal this part of yourself, because the connection is the most important thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And so you take it that the suspension of this online ends up being a big driver of the conversation? Or, like, I take it that the anonymity online allows me, I can feel something like isolation through online interactions, but it's certainly to a different degree if it's in person with people because I have a limited amount of people that I can interact with in person. There's sort of like a physical constraint, but that constraint isn't really there on the internet. So if I find a toxic environment, I can immediately switch to a non-toxic environment, a welcoming environment for my ideas. And maybe people do that. Maybe after engaging with toxic content, maybe they leave the internet, maybe they go to a page where they're going to find a lot of congruence. So I'm wondering, how is that what factored into your thinking of, okay, there's a difference between online and in-person conversation, and one of the things is that the fear of isolation doesn't play as much of a role in online dialogue, discourse?
Right. That is one possible explanation, right? That because we are online, we're not really... We are not trained to be empathetic online or like to get too many social cues. So maybe fear of isolation is not really a thing. But then it's interesting because then we would observe that the probability of sharing your true opinion, or the likelihood of sharing your true opinion, is independent or anything else, right? So if what is driving our choice of revealing our true selves online is our fear of isolation, and because I'm online, this is removed, then I should be showing myself as I come. But that is not happening. There's still a lot of editing that is going on, even in online settings, which means that there are other factors at play, like what we just talked about. Like there's a high incentive for connection. So maybe I just need to play nice because we need to get along. There's also another factor, another variable that we call attitude certainty. This is how sure you are of your opinion. And when people are very sure of their opinion, they share it regardless of what's going on. So I hold this opinion strongly, and like I am going to share it. But if I am less secure about my opinion, so if I'm like, oh, I don't know how I feel about abortion, then I might choose to not share that just because I don't want to get into a confrontation. And there was a third variable that was also interesting and comes with this pleasing others, is that if people perceive the issue to be important to their connections, that also informs the probability of sharing. So the more important it is to others, or it is perceived to be to others, I should say, then the less likely I am to share my opinion. So, or that reduces the likelihood of sharing an opinion. So there's also like, even if we are online, there is still a social game that we are playing. And how we reveal ourselves is being informed by this context as well.
And did you take conversations without any toxic content as a control to sort of see if any of the hypotheses stand?
Right. So the experiment is a different context. So in the experiment, the only thing that we did was we had topics deemed to be controversial, and then topics deemed to be non-controversial as a control. So yes, cool. The answer is we did control for this.
Nice.
Yes, but this was not toxicity. This was just the perceived controversiality of a topic.
Right.
Yeah.
And were you checking the likelihood that someone would share their true opinion, or the likelihood that they would like post at all?
The likelihood they would share their true opinion, because we knew this beforehand.
Yeah.
So we had asked them previously what their true opinion would be, and in the experiment we allowed them to change it as well, and also hide it.
Okay.
So we had measures for this.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool. So maybe, I mean, it makes sense how you can, like what you're doing essentially at the conversation level is complexity science. So it makes sense that you're kind of following through. I'd like to also get a bit of time in to talk about what you're planning on doing at the complexity science hub. Maybe we can also first kind of go into what complexity science is. I mean, I take it that, and you can sort of correct me here and then fill in all the gaps, but I see it historically as you sort of have this, if you can imagine a gradient, you have sort of simplicity, symmetry on one end, and then on the far end, you sort of have sort of disordered complexity. And on the symmetry end, you can use something like differential equations and sort of explain the whole thing. And then on the far end, you have something like the movement of gases and statistical mechanics. And so you need to, average things, take ensembles. Something in the middle is complexity science, right? And that's how I view it, at least. And this is sort of an amalgamation of reading a bunch of people. So I can't say that this framing is mine at all. But in the middle is sort of minds and climate and everything else. And we sort of need a better science for describing that, because we kind of have maths for the other two ends that are seemingly good enough, but the middle is just so hard to figure out. And that's kind of both where you and I come in at different ends of, individuals and then what individuals create. But if you could kind of comment on whether that's an accurate view from your perspective, and then also sort of dive into what complexity science is for you.
Right. I'm not a physicist, so maybe in a second life I will be. So my understanding of complexity is it's a lot simpler. So how I think about it is that as a system, so in a complex system, a complicated system you can take all the pieces apart, and although it might be very, very complicated, if you put them back in, the system is explained by all of its parts. In a complex system, if you take the parts apart and if you put them back together, sometimes you cannot predict the outcome. And that's what we mean by complex. So this is summarized as like the whole is not the sum of its parts. Because when you put the parts together, there are interactions. The parts interact with one another in unpredictable ways that they might give rise to a phenomena that is not explained by the parts in itself. And this is a very difficult problem, especially when we talk about social systems, right? Because it's saying like, okay, so if the individual is fearful of isolation, then I create a social media that, okay, we should not be fearful of isolation anymore. But yet we are seeing very complicated behavior on social media that some of we can understand, some of it is very surprising. So humans are, by definition, complex in nature. So then this makes the study of humans very complicated. And on top of that, the problem with studying human behavior is that once people know they are being observed or studied, or they realize that you're trying to understand them, they change behavior all of a sudden, sometimes in unpredictable ways. But so my intention right now at the Hub is studying what we are calling collective adaptation. So the idea here is how do collectives work together to solve complicated problems, and especially when the environment changes. And we are approaching this from many different perspectives. But one interesting question to ask is, like, for example, understanding why collectives are less. Some collectives are less successful than others in solving the same problems. And previously, this was studied in the realm of collective intelligence, right? But so like kind of like studying optimal strategies. Okay, if you have problem X, then these are the optimal strategies, or this is how you should configure your collective to solve the problem. But that's not how our societies work, right? Some societies have strong cultures, for example, that prevent from rewiring in very real ways. Some other societies have less strong cultures, and maybe there's a problem that requires a stronger social network, but you can't build that from one day to another. So one consequence of this is, for example, there's path dependence in how we as collectives solve problems, right? So we don't have the capacity. Maybe we understand what the optimal solution is, but we don't have the social infrastructure to get there. So we go back to what we know to be safe, right? Or we go back to what our institutional framework allows for, right? Which is not necessarily about safety, but if you live in a dictatorship, there are only so many options that you can choose for. So this is the kind of work we are trying to do with a wonderful team of 8 people led by Mirta Galesik and Henrik Olsson at the Hub. But yes, it's a very ambitious project. This is my work.
That's really cool, especially because adaptive cognition ends up being kind of the core of my focus. And I guess I take it as the way I deal with complexity is looking at an agent and the variation in goals based on context. And it seems like that has something similar to kind of how you view it. Because when you're speaking, a lot of what came to mind was how one individual maintains a lot of different beliefs sort of within a hierarchy, and based on the prioritization within a context, you can get a behavior in one direction or another. And I guess when I view societies just because I have this bias to view everything in the way that I view the mind, is that I view it as almost an extension where you can see the individuals in a collective as just the different sort of hubs of belief within an individual mind, and the constraints of society is sort of the social constraints that an individual might be in. So does that type of analogy make sense, or would you say that it's missing some key components that at the societal level you could never imagine getting at an individual level?
Meaning that, I'm not sure if I understand what the analogy is. So meaning that, the complex system here is society, and the parts are the individual. Is that, and like the whole?
Right? When you look at society and the individual parts that make up the society itself, it might be similar to me looking at the mind and then the components of the mind that make up the mind itself. Is there something that sort of stands out to you clearly as this can't be for this reason? This is why a collection of minds, ensemble of minds, is so different from an individual mind.
I don't know, actually. Yeah, that's interesting. So I think you're asking me to hypothesize on why I
it's like a very philosophical, very theoretical question.
I'm thinking. So you're asking me to hypothesize why is it when individuals come together, they create unexpected patterns, and whether if this is similar or has a connection to how the mind works and its different components, right? Is that the question?
Yeah, if there's anything that stands out to you as particularly different.
I don't know enough about the mind to answer that question, unfortunately. But what I would say is that my sense as to why societies... Oh, wow, you're really putting me on the spot here, but it's interesting. But
I'm asking because I don't know enough about societies, so it's sort of, me trying to fill in the gap on my end.
It's interesting for me to think about these things. But I think my sense why societies can sometimes be unpredictable is that I think as individuals, we are trying to solve too many problems at the same time. And like we have personal problems, we have immediate family problems, we have larger societal problems. And sometimes when the structure becomes so difficult, so the problem complexity becomes so difficult to wrap up in your brain, you end up defaulting to things that you know, right? And this is what I mean by path dependence. And sometimes that can be like a personal thing. Okay, I know that this has worked in the past. But sometimes it's just social cues, right? I don't know. I have I just voted for my country last weekend, and there were 10 people, 10 potential presidential candidates. I'm like, I don't know where to choose. Like, what do I do? So when you are faced with these issues, it's like, maybe you should choose the right choice, or the choice that is logically the best. But what we often do is just we look at our neighbor and say like, oh, who are you voting for? And then we look at our parents like, who are you voting for? And sometimes these cues that we use to solve these problems are not very optimal. But this is the best we can do given the circumstances. And what we are trying to look at in the hub is like whether if we can understand, first of all, how this happens, because that's the first line. But if we understand how it happens, like show individuals or societies a way of saying like, if you look in this way, or if you approach the problem from this perspective, maybe you can see other options. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's a really good answer. Yeah, I guess the thing that came to mind is when individuals are trying to manage uncertainty. So when I introduce uncertainty to an individual system, I can shift their behavior in particular ways. And so experimentally, I also do this.
And fear as well, right?
Yeah, I guess I categorize them as the same.
Okay.
Like I see not an informational uncertainty, but an existential uncertainty.
Exactly.
So that goes from very low level epistemic uncertainty to very high level things like fear. And when you introduce uncertainty, you can get different things, almost like like fracking the individual mind. You get different things at different levels of uncertainty, where if you increase uncertainty to the extreme point, you'll get a very typical response. You constrain the number of outcomes. And then as you relax the uncertainty, the number of outcomes broadens to the point where the individual is comfortable, and then you can kind of get anything, including like silliness and abstraction. So is it also that when you're looking at a societal level, this might be incorrect. Is it that you're narrowing the problem set to say, I'm looking at how societies manage the problem of democratic backsliding, as opposed to just trying to look at the mind in a general sense, because there's so many things that the human tries to do in a day, in the same way that I would constrain the mind to just what happens when you're placed in this situation, this happens?
I think we are looking at the society because the society is an aggregation of individuals, right? So for us, the aggregate level is interesting, but we also study individual behavior. Because to understand how what kind of cognitive strategies, right, people use to solve problems, you need to study the individuals. But what is interesting to us, like, of course, these cognitive strategies are very, very interesting, and like learning, okay, how people solve complicated problems, it's an interesting question. But more to us is like, okay, if I understand how people go through the catalog of potential solutions, how do these aggregate when we put stress into the system? So how do these things, how do these problem-solving skills aggregate if I put a very, very well-connected network, for example? So where I make a lot of people highly dependent on each other. Does this mean that the individual solution the optimal individual solution aggregates to the society? And a similar question, and very relevant as well, how does this work when the social network is loosely connected? So when the relationships are not as strong, there's a lot more freedom to move around. What kind of problems I am more well equipped to solve in that society versus this other society? Yeah. I don't know if that's...
No, it's great. It's one of the things that it makes me think of is that there's no meaning or purpose behind, say, human mind. It is, right? There's a sort of process. It's sort of an emergent property of a process that is billions of years old. When you look at society, you could make the same claim, but in some sense, the societies that we have now, sort of post-language, post-industrialization, post-domestication of the human itself, you kind of have societies, in theory at least, meant to solve a specific set of problems. So humans work together in particular ways as defined by the society in order to achieve certain goals. Does that then add a different spin to how you look at societies, or how do you define it as society, since you're looking so much at sort of this network level?
I don't think I have thought about exactly my definition of society, but I look at it as a combination of many things, right? A combination of institution, of norms, of individuals, of course, and aggregation of individuals. But from my perspective, why is interesting to think about the societal level? It's because the impact is usually at that level. So if we fall into a misinformation pandemic, let's take that example, misinformation pandemic, and then we start electing politicians that are not necessarily there for the common good, then this is a societal impact, right? So in my perspective, it's interesting to see, okay, what is going on with the problems that people in the countryside, for example, are facing, that is making them more likely to vote for parties that don't put the human at the center, or are less solid. They have less empathy for migrants, for example. Maybe having less empathy for migrants solves a problem for them that we are not really understanding. So sometimes I think we tend to dismiss these ideas are them being stupid and not optimal and less intelligent, but it could be solving a real problem for them. It could be solving like a financial uncertainty, for example, lack of perspectives in the countryside. It could be solving real problems that we are not seeing. So for me, these individual problems that then somehow integrate to society and then become these problems that seem to come from nowhere is very interesting. And I don't quite understand how this happens yet.
Okay, I love this, because now like a different framing comes into my mind of this conversation, which is that, so you're looking at this because you're interested at the societal level, because you see it as the level at which we can sort of start looking at the outcomes. And I'm also interested in sort of the outcome of the human project, but I'm interested in sort of the reductionist side of it. Okay. And that's sort of the same thing sort of drove me into cognitive science. And interestingly, Phyllis is working on the connection between the people. So I'd say like we're at like different tiers, right? You're working at this sort of like almost like emergent interaction between individuals that then constructs a society. And you mentioned something really important, which is that you want to treat people almost how I describe it, as open-minded and with empathy, which is what Phyllis is working on. When you deal with individuals who are sort of trying to operate in a system whose behavior we might describe in a particular way because of, self-centrism, right? Of the cornerstone of this sort of like elitist urban mindset of, these some folks vote certain ways because they're uninformed, whereas I think Phyllis would make the argument, rightfully so, that the way for it to sort of function in a better way is for us to sort of treat everybody and be open-minded, which is that you treat people with empathy such that you say they have a reason for behaving the way that they do. Even if I disagree with the reason, they have a reason.
And then you're filling in the reasons with the empirical data. So I definitely think that that's a way to kind of piece all of our levels together.
Yeah, and that is the human imperative, right? I think it's important I think for many, many years, so I come from a developing country, if you wish, and I heard a lot of this talks of like, okay, now we're going to develop you into a better nation. And there was a lot of, and although these intentions are good and they come from a good place, there's a lot of misunderstanding of like, if we are going in a different path, or this is how I felt, it's because we have different problems. If I am not thinking long term, so if I miss a doctor's appointment for my child today because my cow is sick, then I am not stupid. It's just like my cow is my livelihood. So if I let that cow die, who cares if I have a doctor's appointment, because I cannot take my child to the doctors. And I think sometimes, we bonded over this when we discussed this interview, in development work, sometimes this is missed a little bit, because there is the idea that there is the right thing, the right way to do things. And I understand this comes from years of experience and of course hard work. This is not an uninformed position, but I think we are missing a little bit of what problems people are facing on a day-to-day, and how strong that is to shape what the decisions that we make in long-term and short-term.
How does your work help you target that specifically? I mean, I can make assumptions, but yeah. Because I think that's a really important point.
Question.
Yeah.
But I think like right now, what I am, the question that I am mostly interested about is its polarization. This is what is I am coming back to it yet again, because I feel so this is an unstructured thought, but my feeling is that a lot of polarization comes from misunderstanding of where people are at. And we can apply, perhaps my hope is that we can design a few interventions, perhaps, that where people can understand that, okay, we can solve these problems without shouting at each other, without being so polarized, to say that word again. But yeah, that's my main concern at the moment.
Yeah, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
The how, I don't know. So hopefully I will.
Yeah, and can you say a little bit more about how you understand polarization? Like, does it have certain, like I think we kind of know it when we see it, but what's kind of central to it in your view?
I have very I have very network science understanding of what polarization is, for obvious reasons. So how I understand polarization is this: if we think in binary terms, it's just this divide in society, right? So we have two groups that have very distinct opinions that are far away from each other. The two groups are very well connected within them, but sparsely connected between them.
Okay.
That's how I
great.
understand polarization. So it's like I talk to people that are like me, but I don't talk too much to people that are unlike me. That's my understanding of polarization, which is a very networky, sciencey way of thinking. Yeah.
No, but I think that's a very helpful definition. Like,
very visual.
Yeah. No, and it does seem like you need. I guess what I was then thinking as you were describing it is like, are each of those parts essential? And it seems like they are. Like, if you had binary opinions that were far apart with few connections, but then also these groups were not well connected, we would not call that polarized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially if you think about the network as a communication network, right? So
Yeah.
this is the network, this is the people that you would seek out if you wanted confirmation on an idea. So who do you seek out? You seek out like-minded people that are as you, very in the extremes. So there's a reinforcement mechanism there.
Yeah, I guess there's something interesting about if you imagine, say, 10 different people with 10 very different opinions. When we think about polarization, we think about bipolarization. And so that's an interesting sort of thing where it's almost easier to meet in the middle between 10 different people because everybody sees everybody else as having an equal sacrifice. Whereas when it's a bipolar state, it's really difficult because no amount of concessions seems enough for either side. And so it's a really hard thing to disentangle. There's a lot of interesting work, I think possibly relevant to both of you. It's very relevant to my work on looking at conflict areas. So historically sort of conflicting groups of people and sort of how to reach resolution. And there are a lot of studies on discourse about that. But on the cognitive science end, it's specifically about providing validation.
Okay.
And so there seems to be this effect cognitively to receiving validation from somebody. And it's sort of, I guess, intuitive as an ideal in constructive conversation between us as we are able to, say, refine one another's ideas by challenging ideas, but doing it in a way which is validating and admiring the ideas that come at you and not taking for granted that somebody missed something in their thought process. So there is a lot of work on, taking two different groups, entering into a space where validation is provided first, and then that somehow loosening their beliefs. So they would, in the paper, if they were doing something like a Bayesian model, they'd say like it's relaxing the priors that then allows for more open-mindedness, even if it's not, we were kind of talking about this last time Phyllis and I talked, but even if it's not relaxing the priors towards changing the belief about the topic, but it relaxes the priors about changing beliefs about the person. And there's something really valuable there in that maybe we can have a polarized belief environment, but not a polarized social environment.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Okay, that's very interesting. There's something that comes to mind right now. Is there's some work that we are looking into it in the collective adaptation group that suggests that if you have certain individuals play the devil's advocate, so the academic term is be anti-conformists, this also has the potential of depolarizing the system. But the tricky thing here is that this is just modeling work, it's not yet experimental, but the idea here is that the frequency cannot be too high. So then say we're having conversations, every so often it is very good to have somebody on the table that is not conforming to what we are all thinking. But if we do this too much, it doesn't work. So it's somehow, I think it might have to do with, I haven't read the paper, so I would have to read the details, but it has to do with this idea of like every so often we need to get a hint of like saying, okay, let's think about something else. Let's take a step back and think about something else. But it can't be too often, or it can be too obvious. So from an intervention perspective, it's very tricky, because then it's like, okay, what does it mean not too often? Like, do I do it every other conversation? Do I do it once a month? Like, what is not too often? What does that mean? Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you like a
Sure.
really foundational question?
Sure.
So now I'm wondering, from a network science perspective, what does it mean to be well connected?
Mm-hmm.
And does that is that thought of differently when you're thinking about like online communities versus in-person communities?
So well-connected is a term used for community structure.
Yeah.
It means that if you think about all the possible edges that you could have, you almost maximize without being redundant.
Maximize like the number of interactions or
connections between connections.
Like, maybe what's a
interactions.
connection is my
So
question.
an edge in a network can mean many things, right? So
Okay.
it depends on what kind of system you're looking at. So say we're looking at a communication system.
Okay.
So an edge would mean where is a line of communication open between the two of us. So if
Okay.
I can call you, for example, that would be an
Okay.
edge. You can also think about social support networks, for example. And in that case, an edge would mean who would be the person that I would rely for X, Y, and Z. So if I need to ask for money, who in my network is more likely to give it to me? So if I think of you as a potential candidate for lending me money, then there's an edge. Yeah, so that's the tricky part, because in network science, the edge is the definition comes down to what network you're representing. But when we talk about polarization, this it's somehow related to a communication network. It's like, who do I communicate to about my beliefs on topic X, right? So when we mean a community is well connected, it's like this is a community of like-minded people, say of left-wing people, and we know they regularly communicate to each other. They go out for coffee, they go out for a podcast, they meet at university, they are friends in social media, so on and so forth. So all of these have almost maximized the possibility of connections. So they are internally very, very well connected.
When I think about it, it seems to me like maximizing the possibility of connection?
Yes.
Yeah. That is easier to maybe achieve online than in person.
Right. Assuming that you maintain this
Yeah, but that
right?
it kind of comes cheaper online or something.
Yeah,
like I can
for
reach
sure.
out really easily, but
Of
what
course,
that how meaningful that is to my life or something, or how
That's a
or
different question.
or what that gets me. Does it get me like lending money, or does it get me just getting a like or something like that? So then I guess I'm wondering like how the differences in the type of connections, like what impact that has for polarization. Like, do we get more polarization online because it's easier in a sense to become well connected?
That's a tricky question, actually. There's some research that says we are more polarized because social media exists. There's other research that says social media is just playing into already existing societal divides and just maybe accelerating the process, but is not a predictor. So it's a difficult question.
Do you have like an opinion or like a instinct?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I don't think social media is causing polarization, but I do think that it's driving it. It's helping it in a way. At least up until now, that is my perception. But I think there's a lot about what communication. So the reason why I think social media is helping polarization is because I think it's impacting the way we are communicating content, political content. So it's making us see content that is is more likely to make us extreme. That is the reason. Or is promoting type of conversations that are more likely to bring out an extreme side in us. But this is just a hypothesis. I haven't really tested this.
Yeah, I suppose it changes how often we engage with information, or how much information we can engage with in a given setting. So if because we've seen polarization has existed since the dawn of sort of any society. So that's kind of an easy one to rule out as, only the internet causes polarization. But then you get something where, maybe it speeds up the pace just because of how much information. If I pick up a newspaper 50 years ago, there's a limited amount of information that I have access to in that newspaper versus online, it's sort of unlimited. And plus, there are certain aspects to reading a newspaper that aren't driving my engagement in the way that an algorithm is built to drive my engagement. It's also not as visually stimulating, which is another thing.
And it's also about depth. Sorry for interrupting, but it's also about depth and content, right? So if there's some suggestion, for example, that young people that are born into TikTok and this social media, the attention span is really shortened. So the way also these messages are being changed, the speed with which you get the message also doesn't allow you for depth. And that is also problematic because some of these issues are very, very complicated, and I can't summarize it in a 20-second TikTok video. I mean, I don't even know how a TikTok video lasts for, but it's also like this idea that I can wrap up a complicated problem in a very short content, and that gives me an understanding of what's going on. I think that's also the problem. That's more with the format of social media rather than the content itself.
Yeah, and I guess there's this thing of if you pick up a newspaper and you don't like it, you can pick up a different newspaper, and maybe your city, if it's a big city, 60 years ago has 6-7 newspapers maximum. But with the online environment, if you don't like something, you can go find something that fits your needs, even if that's something obscure. And I think that there's something to that effect where you can find a community of people who will believe anything or claim to believe anything online. And I completely agree that the internet doesn't cause polarization. It might hasten it. But I think that what it does do in an interesting way is generate conspiracy theories that have traction in a way that I don't know if was possible before, because you could believe any random thing 60 years ago in any city that you're in. But now you can go to the internet and look for a community of people worldwide that believe that, and there might be 100, there might be 10, there might be 5. But if you form a Reddit channel and start talking every day, that's completely different than being the one person in your village or town or city that believes that lizards control the earth. And so there's something to, I guess, also that harkens back to what you were talking about before, which is when you enter a room and there's a certain amount of coherence in between your beliefs and everybody else's beliefs, a certain degree of congruence, you can find that room on the internet where you weren't able to find before.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And there's also an incentive to, because social media drives engagement, then sometimes misinformation is engagement, right? So then there's an incentive to not control misinformation. And now we are seeing social media platforms refusing to do fact-checking anymore. It's just like because it's too costly and it drives views. So then it might not be causing, but I'm sure that's affecting our views on I don't know, polarization and whether if a far right is the right party, right?
Yeah, because it's interesting because they've incentives from two directions to not manage content. One is because it costs money to pay people to manage it, and the other is that it decreases engagement. And so you have two reasons for them to not. And I guess that's what we're seeing increasingly.
Yeah.
So I guess, what other interesting questions do you see that if you had many years, a lot of money, a lot of time, what would you tackle?
Oh God. I think it would be very interesting for me. I think the web is a wonderful thing. I was lucky enough to grow up without internet and then have the internet when I was kind of like an older child. So I remember how life is without internet. It's not very fun. It was very difficult. Right? I think internet is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I would really like to think about how we can have internet communities that are safe and that are conducive to positive dialogue and that doesn't play on our worst fears and worst insecurities about human nature. So if I could, if I had unlimited money and resources, that's what I would do. How do we design it in a way that doesn't? So I think sometimes this gets the free speech argument gets kind of like confused in these ideas like, okay, we want to design social media or you want to control it. And I think it's not controlling, it's not about control. It's about, we already have enough evidence that if we let this go, it can create many undesirable negative effects. So is there a way in which we can design this online space such that we avoid the negative aspects of it and we celebrate the wonderful things, the connection, finding people that are like you. I think this is a positive thing, right? When I was a child, if I had a different interest than my friends, like, too bad. I mean, I couldn't find other friends. Like, it was just what I had, right? So I think we need to play into these wonderful aspects of the web, but without being naive about what it can cause if we don't really look at the problems that we have right now. So yeah, that's what I would do.
Can you imagine what that would look like? Because yeah, I mean, there are definitely alarm bells some people would have about control. I'm not necessarily one of them. In terms of sort of building an environment that is able to bring out the best aspects of our nature, which I think are plentiful. And I do think that a majority of people engaging with the internet are doing it genuinely and with good intent. And I guess I have this assumption, partially fed by data, partially just kind of engaging with people doing the work that I do, that most people want a positive environment and don't want to engage toxically, and that there is a minority of people who have an outsized voice just because of the type of engagement it triggers and their sort of willingness to engage in a toxic way. So would you envision an environment where this kind of thing would get filtered out or diverted to a different space where you could choose to engage or not engage with people who through sentiment analysis are, shown to be engaging in a toxic way?
Yeah, I think with this filtering thing, then we can get into like the controlling argument, right? So I don't know what the right thing is. I'm sure there are some policies that one can design to sort of control a little bit of that. But one thing that I find interesting at the moment is that I think LLMs, or the development with AI, has some interesting features that we can use. So we might be able, so we talked about nudges a lot, right? Nudging people to not share misinformation, nudging people to maybe be anti-conformist so that the system becomes less polarized. But what if LLMs would be good enough to do that nudging for us? In a way that we can identify, okay, this might be going in a direction that we don't want. So instead of having to bring a human being to suggest an alternative method, let's maybe investigate the possibility of LLMs interacting in this way. And that goes into, there are a lot of ethical questions here that of course one should discuss, but there might be an AI-human interaction in there that could potentially bring out more positive aspects online. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are many levels to this, but that's the one thing that I can identify right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sort of building in an automatic incentivization process to kind of facilitate some kind of behavior. There's also this sort of similar concept, but the opposite framework, the sludge concept, which is the nudging is, shifting in a particular direction. Sludge is that you sort of slow down or make difficult, create obstacles for certain behavior. So I guess, I could see that this using AI to determine when somebody maybe needs to, when you could make something a little bit more difficult if somebody's behaving in a certain way, to sort of incentivize behavior as opposed to sort of filtering them out outright or kicking them off a platform, which I do think has a lot more negative consequence than not. Sometimes you create discourse around something that people didn't even know about just by virtue of banning them or removing them.
Yeah.
So is there also, I mean, you explained a lot of your work so well. Is there something that's driving you? I feel like you've given us that definitely with your sort of previous answer of what the larger goal is. But is there something that drove you into it, or something that continually drives your work in terms of how you feel or the way you see the world?
I think because I didn't grow up with social media or the internet, I am very well aware of the impact, both positive and negative, that it has had in my life, in my relationships, and in the lives of people around me. And that is something that both, as I said, I celebrate, but there are some aspects that I find extremely scary. And yeah, so that is the fear, both the fear and the excitement are driving me right now. But mostly the fear at the moment. So seeing the direction this is taking at the moment scares me a little bit.
Are you on social media? Do you still have social media accounts?
Interestingly enough, I am not on social media.
Interesting.
And this is for two reasons, because I think they're not going in a good direction, but also because I realize I cannot have a healthy relationship with social media.
I also got off social media, I guess, like 2 years ago now, and it was like very transformative to be off. I was surprised, because I wouldn't have even thought I was like a social media person like that. I didn't think I used it that much, and I never posted. I was mostly kind of like a social media consumer, but it also was having a very negative effect for me.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was having kind of like a positive effect. I felt connected to people. I live abroad, so I sort of knew what people were doing. But then at some point, I realized that I don't have relationships with these people. And I know a lot about their lives. It's very weird.
It is weird.
I haven't talked to them for years, and yet I know that they got married, divorced, have children. and that was a scary thought to me. It's like how, in my case, this is a very personal experience, how for me social media become a replacement for a relationship, which was scary in a way. But then also I don't think I have enough self-control to use social media in a healthy way. I think some people use social media wonderfully, and they have self-control, they use it as a platform, and it's good for them. I am unfortunately not one of those people. So I need to take a step back. But I do study it, which I feel is a little bit hypocritical. It should probably be on social media.
I think but you were on it, so it's not like you. Yeah, I think it brings an interesting perspective for sure. Do you think it's I mean, I guess you're saying you think it's complicated, but I guess I'm wondering, like, should we think it's a good thing to have well-connected networks online? Because maybe having that does make people less well-connected in person.
I think for me it was very good. So I moved away from Ecuador when I was 17. And at the time, I think Facebook was starting to be a thing, I believe. I think I opened my account with Just Move. But I do remember having to sit for hours in my dorm room waiting for my mom to call on like this very old phone. And like if there were news, like emergencies or stuff, like I wouldn't find out until Sunday when my mom called. And I really don't miss that world. Like for me, it's a lot better if like if I have my mom at a
Yeah.
phone call away and we can call each other and talk to each other, I think that has improved my relationship a lot, especially because I live abroad.
Yeah.
So that's a positive aspect. I wouldn't want that to go away.
But we can have that
personally.
without social media. Like, I guess I'm thinking, like, maybe the issue is, like, the number of people we get to be well connected to with social media. Like, it's super important that you're connected to, like, your actual family and your actual friends, but not
Right.
everyone you went to middle school with or something like that. Like, maybe that's, like, maybe if we get polarization because we're both well connected in our groups and poorly connected between them, like, if we just made the groups less well connected, that's one way to reduce it, right? Like,
Right. But that's not an argument for getting rid of social media, right? That's maybe
I guess
an
I was thinking
argument-
social media is the thing that makes us well connected, or would there be other things that online
But
specifically?
as you said, it could also be exposing us to new ideas that we didn't consider before. So I don't think necessarily because we are in social media we are connected exclusively to like-minded people. I think
Yeah,
if you
right.
seek out other things, you could find alternatives. So it's not necessarily bad.
I guess one thing for me is in activist communities, even though you can get pages that are sort of suppressed, I think that the connectivity within activist communities on social media is unparalleled.
Yes.
And I guess I can go in both directions. Mine is on the leftist side, but yeah, I don't know how else I would be able to find organically and connect with activist communities.
Yes.
And I guess that for me is a crucial reason to remain on certain platforms, even though I also don't post. I'm a consumer of social media. It's sort of a major source of news, both sort of scientific and political, because I guess now most of the time I spend is on Blue Sky. And that's kind of where people post if you're doing activism, but also scientific and philosophical papers, kind of keeping abreast of things. So I guess the democratization that it provides on certain platforms more so than others, for sure, for me is a crucial factor.
Yeah, no, I see it for sure. I get, okay, to be the devil's advocate that we have said is sometimes helpful. Like, that's because these things exist. Like, given that it exists, you need to use it, because then you will not be well connected. And how would we do activism, if not without these tools? But we used to, right? And so I guess I feel like, to play the slight devil's advocate, not that the devil needs more advocates, but, you use the language of, like, I don't know where I do that. It's like, yeah, you, user of these technologies that now exist, don't know how else to do that. But if they didn't exist, we would find a way. Like, we have these needs to organize together. And I'm wondering, like, yeah, like I definitely see the value of these tools. And it is so difficult to imagine doing this work that needs doing without them. But given some of the dangers, I guess it makes me try to imagine, like, what if we didn't have these? Like, what would we do instead? It's not that we do nothing instead, right? So I wonder.
And maybe this is a bit too much of a step back, but I guess the thing for me is because the internet's a communication tool developed for war. I mean, by DARPA in the 70s. I guess the thing is that whatever elements at the broad scale are going to be using this type of connectivity, I guess I feel it's necessary for the grassroots to be able to connect in the same way. And I guess, like, any colonial power will use the internet, and I suppose the information, the speed of information transfer that they can achieve is going to be way more rapid because they're going to have networks to communicate on specifically. And I guess I want the same type of enfranchisement of people in the democratic process that social media offers. Maybe that's too much of a step back, but I guess that's my broader sort of motivation, more towards like this, more towards the anarcho-syndicalist type sympathies. But yeah, I see more unity and collectivism achieved through social media rather than a fragmentation that might happen without it.
And a good example of this is the Arab Spring, right?
Yeah.
That wouldn't have happened without social media, because you say like, oh yes, we used to organize ourselves, and no, I mean, these people it was very difficult to organize collectively without social media. Now it's a different world, and governments are also using social media to control citizens, which is a bit of a flip. But there are positive things that happened out of it that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely get the concerns, and I guess it's
and I see the benefits for sure. And I used to be a political organizer, so I have these like it's a hugely powerful tool, and you're definitely right that some amazing, some very important things couldn't happen without it. But I wonder sometimes.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you're doing the work that kind of looks at the pros and cons and understands really the specifics of the mechanisms, what it is that we're dealing with. If we are going to take social media to be a tool for good, ostensibly, how does it work? What kind of things do we have to be afraid of, and what kind of patterns do we see? So I really appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you.
Maybe we're already past an hour and a half, so maybe we can slowly wrap it up there. Unless, you're free to add anything you want. We have plenty of time if you want to add anything else.
Oh no, I think we've talked enough. It's been a very nice conversation. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you.